Hopefully you can see my screen now. Dang it, who chewed my tree? Hopefully everybody's there. I should be able to pause partway through this. This afternoon, we actually were answering the questions as we went. So we didn't, but let's see how this goes. Okay, so tonight's topic is animal damage to trees and what to do about it. And I'm Ken Bevis, and I am the DNR Stewardship Wildlife Biologist. I have this really great job where I get to help people with questions and give presentations. I work with Kevin a lot. And Kevin, that's Kevin, he's really smart. And we use this rubber chicken every chance we get for a prop to do our presentations. This is what you're missing tonight online. And this is Brendan. And yeah, he's smarter and better looking than both of us, but we kind of managed to get by with him in the picture. So thank you, Brendan, for keeping us going. Thank you so much again. There we go. I hope you guys are laughing at that. So you are here. Here we are in the forest setting of Washington. About 2/3 of our state is naturally forested, ranging from the really wet forest, over here on the coast, Puget Sound Trough, a little bit drier, Cascades, foothills, high mountains, over to the eastern Washington drier forest, up to the Rocky Mountain types here in the Northeast, and that really interesting Blue Mountain massive that's kind of like that, but kind of like that. But anyway, that's where we are, and the wildlife across there that we deal with. Just as by way of context of why, you say, why is the DNR involved? Well, small landowners own about 4.5 million acres of forest land, which is quite a bit in this state. And there's over 200,000 of us. There might even be like 235 to 40,000 now. And the lands are in this dark color here. And you kind of look at the way they're configured around the state. And this is the people that we work with. And this is the WSU Forestry Extension Group, and that's the DNR group and the conservation districts. And we help people with, between 5 and 2,000 acres, but we'll help people with smaller acreages to write your plans, cost shares, advice, give classes. We work with Extension and the conservation districts a lot. There's our website. You can find us. It's a really cool operation. There's not very many of us. That's Matt Preventure, our West Side forester on the right. And we have half of a forester in Eastern Washington. We're pretty bare bones, but we try, and here we are. So what did you get yourself into? Well, it's sort of like this, and there's Kevin talking about forestry, but it's not quite like that because, well, we're on the computer tonight. But here we go. So we're going to talk about trees, and we're going to talk about things that eat trees. And when I spoke a little while back, I talked about things that lived in dead trees. And the first time we talked about things that lived in trees in general. Well, just last week, Kevin gave this excellent presentation about forest health, where we talked about insects eating trees and some of the issues with insects and fungus and forest health. But I'm not going to go there. I'm going to talk about animals that eat trees, pretty much vertebrates. Yeah, they're all vertebrates, and some of the interactions we have, excuse me, a little sip of water there, with these variety of animals that like to munch on our trees. So that's what we're going to do. Let's see, just glancing. Grace Harbor College. Kevin says he's smarter than the average rubber chicken. So here we go. So we're going to talk about animals tonight. So here's my basic outline. Wildlife damage on small forest lands. And what kind of wildlife is doing this? The good guys, the bad guys. What is the problem? What's the situation, and what can I do? So a lot of times we sort of skip step 2 and go straight to the last one, and which is logical. So it's sort of a little bit like a flow chart. So let's start out. The good wildlife. This is the ones we like. These are the ones we like to watch. The beautiful songbird or the deer. And I like to do deer a lot. So this deer was in. I was at what's the Glacier National Park in Canada? What's it called right across the border? Oh, Waterton Park. And this deer's laying in the park, and I got an ice cream cone, and she came walking over and said, and I did not give her the ice cream cone. And right after this happened, the park guy yelled at me, "Hey, don't." So it's like, sorry, I almost got deported for that. But once they start to take something we want, they become bad wildlife. So you might have, another example like bald eagles, regal, everything. They're great until they try to get your dog, and then all of a sudden oh, bald eagle becomes bad wildlife. So they're good until they're bad, and they're bad when they take something from us. Well, forestry bad, that'd be a good name for a band, wouldn't it, Kevin? Forestry bad. Are usually deer or elk or voles, beavers, black bears, things that damage and eat our desired trees and our plants, and so this is aimed at forestry. And interesting, our earlier commentary about gardens, it's true, but bad means they're eating the plants we want. And so how do you deal with this circumstance? Well, first thing is let's study the situation, and often the situation starts being observed by virtue of seeing like one or just a couple of trees, and you go, hey, what's going on? So start to notice these things, like what is being affected, how is it being affected, and how much. These are things to pay attention to. Is there really property damage and damage to the plants and the plantings that is going to cause you issues, on you go? And then you determine a threshold for action. It doesn't have to be, 20%, 62%, whatever. And this is really the thought process that you enter into when you're dealing with any circumstance of animal damage. And so it is a little bit of a flow chart. And Mr. Stebbins will find it hard to believe that I actually think in flow charts, though there's a lot of extra direction to it. But anyway, this is what you go through when you do this. So first step, what kind of damage do you see? Is it chewing, like this right here on a tree? Is it a nipped off tip? Is it a girdling at the bottom of a tree that killed it? Look at that, that's a dead tree right there. There's something going on right there. Is there like scuffing all the way to point of almost girdling like this where it's stripped off? What could it be? So just a little, kind of detective work here, that rodents tend to chew on things down low at the bottom of the stem of small diameter trees. So this is probably a vole chew right here. And this one I think is a rabbit chew right here because it's a little bit higher. Deer and elk, little natural history tidbit, they don't have any teeth on the top palate. They have incisors on the bottom. So when they nip, oh, they're missing here. They tend to tear it. So the cut will be kind of a tear rather than a smooth snip like a rodent. Like rodents have incisors on both sides, so they'll snip it right off. So that's one. So you got to kind of be a detective. You got to look for clues like these and think about the type of animal that might have done what you witness, and think about that as something to work with. So how might you assess this? Well, look at your stand and think about where am I now? What is your desired future condition of that stand? Because one of the wonderful, wonderful challenges to small forest landowners, and I happen to be one too, is to place yourself in the mindset of stand dynamic, i.e., stands develop over many years, decades, sometimes quicker than you think, but it still takes quite a bit of time. And so you're participating in this slow motion process of forest development. So where are you now? Where are you going to go? So how do you assess it? Well, Joe, what? Frankly, just walking around and looking at stuff is fine. Keep some notes. Note the occurrences of, and you have to ask yourself, is that enough information to help you decide if you're going to do something or what to do? That we're going to get there. So, for example, if you had a young stand with mortality that you were concerned about, you might actually gather some data. It's pretty scientific, but a little bit of well-gathered data can really help clarify your thinking on something like this. And so here's just a simple methodology might be to do 1/100th acre plots. And I was thinking of like a relatively new plantation, and that's make a string, about 12 feet long, and go out there and take a circle, keep a tally, number of dead trees, number of chewed trees, how many are crooked, how many are injured or dead. I say take 10 or 20 plots. That's not statistical at all, but 10 gives you sort of a number where you could actually have some kind of summary. And I say try to be random, you know, I mean, try not to bias your plots to put them right where every dead tree is. So you try to be, but this will give you a crude estimate of what's really going on there. And while you do that, you might actually have a count of how many trees you have. So you might want to gather some data. Okay, so let's start with deer. And interestingly, it came up. Deer are fairly ubiquitous across the state. We have three species, well, two species and three varieties, let's say. So there's the west side black-tailed deer, and much to our surprise, it actually has, yes, a black tail. And the mule deer, let's go over here on the right, has a black tipped tail, same big ears, and they're actually the same species. A blacktail is considered a subspecies of mule deer, and they're a little bit darker. They're a little smaller, but not really similar, but they live on the west side of the mountains in denser habitats. Mule deer live on the east side of the mountains in open habitats. And then there's those little squirrely white tails. Look, a white tail. How about that? How many of us have ever seen one startled where they throw that tail up and that big white spot bounces away? They occur east of the Cascades in localized but pretty broad populations, and all three of these species of deer are well adapted to live with people in towns and that sort of thing, which is a relatively recent phenomenon. They're all browsers. They eat mostly shrubs and sometimes trees, but they tend to eat woody vegetation. They eat grasses and forbs too, but they're mostly browsers, and they will eat trees in the early part of the year, but these are two of their favorite foods, salmonberry and elderberry. Elk. Now, elk are localized around the state. Small forest landowners, let's say in the area around Morton and Randall. Randall's like Elk Central. They live in town, they chomp everybody's trees. Over by Mount Rainier, there's a lot of elk in parts of eastern Washington, but not everywhere, interestingly. And elk are mostly grazers. They mostly eat grasses and forbs, but they will chomp on some of the browser stuff too. And they're big, and they're a whole different set of issues in regard to preventing browse damage. So early in the year, and it seems to be pretty universal, deer in particular, but elk will too, will browse and eat the tips of the growing trees. They like to, and cedars, they'll eat the whole thing, but they like to bite off that yummy little terminal leader there, and it just totally messes up the tree. Most of us know that the growth pattern of a conifer is you have your terminal leader that goes up, and there's the lateral buds, and oh, that's this year, and then next year it does it again. Well, that gets messed up, boom, like that. Now there's going to be a side branch come out, and the form of the tree is not going to be nearly as good. Well, here's one slick little technique that many of us know, and these things were actually invented for this very purpose. It's called a Vexar tube, not an endorsement, but they're a really excellent little tool. And you put them over particularly cedar trees, and the deer can't browse the tip. The idea is to protect the tip. This one needs to be moved up. This is Ron Monroe. He used to be the lead forester at Crystal Lake. Rest his soul, he passed a couple years ago. But notice these stakes right here, and he's putting one of these on a cedar, a sapling. There's my old friend Boyd Norton. And look what they've done here. They've moved them up. So here's this long stake. This one hasn't been moved yet, but they move them up to protect that tip. And you just got to get them high enough that the deer can't reach them while they're standing there browsing. And I meant to say this about deer a second ago, that deer tend, and I always hear saying, somebody's going to tell me a story to this different than this, but they tend to not stand up on their hind legs. They tend to browse just as high as they can reach standing there like that. And we've all seen places like on the San Juans where there's a browse line. It's like right across at a certain height, and it's about a little bit higher than shoulder height. I'm holding my arm out right here. Can you see that? But basically deer, and they will, there are deer that will stand up and go after apples and things, and some that will lean on something. But in general, they don't do that a lot. And these tubes essentially stay below browse height. So you move the thing up. This is Doug Stinson. And note, he's got the long stake. So if you do decide to do Vexar, get the long stake, the taller one, because then you can move it up. And here he's doing a whole bunch of them out here, and they had a lot of browse going on that place. Now, some landowners, excuse me, myself included, have been using metal cages like this. And this, for small landowners who don't have like thousands of trees, I'm starting to believe that this might be the best way to go. And that is this 2x4 hardware cloth, I guess they call it. You roll it into a coil, one fence post, boom, done. And this will last forever. When you plant some more trees somewhere else, you can move that thing and use it again, probably rest of your lifetime. This fellow here is planting alder trees on an old timber landing, and he's got chicken wire between 3 stakes, and it's pretty floppy, but I bet that works too. So just basically a homemade metal cage to keep them away. This is George Takai from over by Spokane, and George had planted a bunch of trees out here, I think some cedars too, and white pine, and he had just piled brush around them. See the little orange flag there? So there's a tree right down in there, and he's adding branches to it. And George maintained, he's like, you know what? If I do that long enough, it seems to work. And so he didn't have intense browse, but he would just pile a brush pile around them. And I love this one. This gentleman had chain link fence, and by golly, here's a big metal pole and some cable, and ain't no deer getting in there. And it worked. Look at that. Those cedars are above that cage. So planted cedars are particularly vulnerable to deer browse. And one major strategy is to cage them somehow. So there's a couple of ideas. Some people ask me about repellents. It's like, well, you know, their repellents work. And I bet you there's somebody in the room here who has done, uh, uh, let's see, has done, what am I saying? Used repellents. And there's a whole bunch of them. It's really interesting. This one's a commercial. I find out Sea Dust is no longer in business. But I was thinking about this, that a measure of how intense deer problems are on people's trees and gardens, go in the hardware store and count how many varieties of deer repellent there are. This was on Whidbey Island, and Whidbey has lots of deer, San Juans, and from what I can gather from listening to people, all of them work sometimes. And there's some really interesting stories. I like to call them folk remedies, but like one was Irish Spring soap. That Irish Spring soap, for some reason, this lots of people would put it like soap on a rope, and the deer would stay away for a while, and then they would decide, no, you know, it doesn't bother them anymore. So repellents work, but what's the problem with repellents? You have to reapply them over and over and over, and if you miss, you're done. They eat your tree, and it's often a problem. So repellents are good for ornamentals, small scale things like maintenance, but in the forest, it's just a really hard way to go to be able to keep up with it. Okay, so we're talking about deer. Let's say something about deer. Natural history, gee whiz, is every year a male deer grows a set of bones out of the top of their head. Now you think about that for a minute. And this is entirely amazing that this tissue right here at certain signals of day length and everything else grows this velvet covering, which has got a lot of blood vessels in it. And it's very sensitive. I once had a chance to actually pet a deer, I know you're not supposed to, that had velvet antlers, and you could tell he liked it. It was like, oh, that feels good. And so this is full of vascular tissues, and it's transferring calcium from other parts of his body to build essentially a set of bones on the top of their head that they like to polish out to use as weapons, which that would be pretty handy if a cougar was after you, and as a secondary sexual characteristic in the fall. The girls like it when a feller's got a nice rack on his head there. And so, this is an amazing annual process, but how does it go from there to there? And there's a definite period in like, I want to say early September, August, when it starts to itch and the deer looks for some place to rub that velvet off, and they like to find trees of appropriate scale. This is an elk rub right here, slightly bigger tree, a little bit higher, but the deer will often use something on the order of oh, let's see, 1.5 to 3 inches, and it needs to be whippy. It needs to be something that the deer can get all around and fight. I probably somebody here has watched this, but I think they do it mostly at night where you can't really see them, but there's fighting that tree, rubbing it around. And you can almost predict in your small forest which trees are going to get rubbed because they're going to be ones that the deer can get around. This is on Whidbey Island on the Schrager family property, and they had decided two things. One, they didn't want, I think this was a walnut or some special tree. So here's a big post in the ground, here's another one, and they found out that this irrigation piping kept the deer from rubbing that tree. So this was kind of like, no, 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 you quit that. This is a tree actually on my property. And so these were planted after the fire, another story, doing okay. And they got up about this high. This is how high they are now. This is a couple of years ago. So I took the cages off. What happened? The deer destroyed like 4 of my trees. Oh, so I put the cages back to keep the deer from getting at them because they really like those little whippy pine trees. So in regard to rubbing, you can decide, I'm going to give them that tree and even make it easier for them, or you can armor it. It's kind of like putting it in a cage. Otherwise, you really don't have much of a choice for preventing rubbing. Okay, so here we go. Let's talk about bears. Bears. So bears are a really interesting animal in so many ways. And they have this habit that they destroy trees that are in this sapling stage. And it's like, tell me it ain't so smoky. Oh my gosh, wait, I thought bears were our friends. Well, hopefully you laughed at that. Remember, say it ain't so, Joe. But yes, they do. And it's not a really common occurrence. It occurs in certain parts of the state, in certain areas. This stand right here has had a bear go in there, a bear or some bears, and do this thing where they strip the bark and eat the cambium in the early spring when there isn't other food out there in the in the forest. And so it looks kind of like this, and I imagine somebody in here has seen it, but this is Mike Nystrom, my old colleague, looking at this tree, and the bear will go into the same area. I forgot to say this, that they think it's a learned behavior. Certain bears do this and they think they learned it maybe from their mothers, but there can be places where there's lots of bears and no bear damage, and there'll be some places where there's just lots and lots of bear damage. And we think that it's just certain bears, a minority, we might add, have this habit of stripping trees. And it looks like that. And there's one that's, it's not as big as you think, but it's very troubling to landowners. And so it's like, oh, they tried, here's some of the remedies. A few years back, they actually tried feeding the bears. So they put out these feeding programs, and the timber companies did this for quite a few years. And finally they realized, it's not necessarily cost effective because, well, you're feeding all of the bears, not just the ones that are causing the problems. And well, you're teaching bears to eat human food, and never forget this, that a fed bear is a dead bear. And so you may have artificially been raising their populations by virtue of helping them be better fed in the early spring. So there was all of these things, and I think they just basically finally decided it was not cost effective. And I could be corrected on that, but those programs I do believe are not going on right now. So there's removal of the bear. So you could go into the area and you could trap the bear. Sometimes WDFW will trap troubled bears like this, or people will shoot them. Frankly, bears are a game animal. You could buy a license and go out and harvest a bear, and that's perfectly fine. But if you're just trying to protect your trees, removal, you may not get the right bear. You don't necessarily know, which is a kind of an interesting wrinkle. So, almost the only remedy for hardcore bear damage areas now is bear removal. And so I wondered about this. Could you fence to protect trees from bears? You probably could, but man, you'd have to use chain link, and then you'd have to put it on a lot of trees because there'd be thousands of these things. It would be really hard to do. And besides, you're dealing with bears. I mean, bears are notorious for just tearing stuff apart. So I don't know. It's an intractable situation, but bear damage. Okay. How am I doing on time, Kevin? Not bad. 7:30. Okay. I'm going to keep going if that's okay. Do I have any burning things right now? I have not peeked in a minute.
Here's
Okay.
a couple good questions. One is about when can you stop armoring the cedar tree from deer antler
Yeah.
rubbing? How old or how big do trees need to
I,
be?
I would say about three, 3 to 3 inches, let's just say, because then it won't move. It won't whip. Right. Yep. So I think it has to do with the flexibility of it.
And here's another question for you. Do they lose their antlers? And if
Yes.
so, is there an open wound that's prone to infection until it closes up?
The deer and elk will shed their antlers in like March, and no, it scabs over, and it turns into a little bump in just a few months, and then it's not a very long period of time before they start growing back. But they lose their antlers almost like a tree loses its leaf, and it more or less scabs over. It's just really interesting how that works. Yep. Okay. Lower branches. Right. And tree, yes. And when the tip of the tree is damaged, the shape of the recovering tree will be different, but not always, it's not always disastrous. Okay, good. That kind of catches up. Let's go to beavers because beavers are a really interesting animal, and they're having a bit of a renaissance in our part of the world because the well, two things. Trapping has been essentially, it's not very, people don't do it very much anymore. There is no fur market to speak of. How many people in this group know someone who traps? And if they do, it's probably a professional. So beavers, yeah, they're around and their numbers are basically expanding. And their ecological benefits are pretty remarkable because they indeed create wetlands, and wetlands are hotspots of habitat for fish and amphibians and birds and everything. The bad news is when they create these wetlands, sometimes they flood areas that were previously meadow or trees. But when they do this, they also raise the water table. So it turns out beavers are a powerful weapon against drought. And so they have this remarkable ecological effect. They're a keystone species in that they create habitats, and they also cause a lot of conflict with people because they do things that we don't like. They chew our trees down. It's like, come on, you guys. They chew our trees and they flood places where we don't necessarily want to be flooded. I'm laughing because beavers don't care. They just work. They got to chew. They got to chew. They got to chew, 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 and off they go. And so if you're dealing with beavers, their damage is going to be pretty obvious. Well, what can you do about it? Well, you can armor, once again, the trees that you don't want them to cut all the way down. And this does work. You just put wire around it and they'll go choose something else. If they're damaging like culverts, and this is a classic because they will use the road prism as their dam, and boy, beavers are smart. They just block that pipe right there and bam, they got a wetland. And so there's a lot of different techniques for trying to deal with them. Well, here's the thing. Now that their numbers have been expanding because we're not persecuting as much as we used to, and we're trying to figure out how to live with them because of their benefit wherever we can, um, if you remove them, there's going to be another one come in, usually, not always. And because beaver life history, there'll be these little colonies that spin off young every other year that go look for another place to live. And the young often will, start over somewhere on the same creek. So you got to figure out. So this website right here, beaversnorthwest.org, this is a great effort at helping to teach people to live with beavers. So check that out, Beavers Northwest. Brendan will put that into the things. So if you have beavers, you got a problem, and hopefully you can figure out how to live with them. We're doing beaver restoration around the state. This is in the Methow project. This beaver was trapped in a suitcase trap, they call it. It was a live trap, a little bit of castor, bam, got him. And they're doing work where they're finding places where it's okay for beavers to be in the upper watersheds, that sort of thing. And so basically trying to gain the ecological benefit of water storage up where they're not a problem. And there's several projects around the state like this. So if you have beavers, this might be an option. And so anyway, so beavers, great book, Ben Goldfarb, called Eager. Okay, let's talk about chewing critters. That's a vole. It's not a mouse. That's a vole, V-O-L-E. And it's not a mole. It's a vole. Voles are meadow mice. They're called, little short tail, small, almost invisible ears. They make those tunnels down in the grass that you see. They live subterranean, but they eat roots and they eat vegetation, and they will chew young trees. That's probably a vole chew right there. Rabbits, snowshoe hare, cottontails, wild areas near mountain snowshoe hares, the ones that change colors. Cottontails, introduced in the state probably in like the 40s as a game species, are localized. They got that little fluffy tail there. And these guys will chew your trees. This is probably rabbit chew right here. And it's the same kind of issues. Like, okay, how do you deal with something like that? Well, here's one I like this, a predator assist. If you had an area where you're trying to get your trees established and you're worried about voles and rabbits and things, there's no better mousetrap than an owl. And how do owls hunt? Owls are perch hunters. They sit there and look. And the attack angle from a perch is, I like to describe it as, say, like 30 degrees. Think about the times you've seen a hawk going down to get something. And I'm saying 30 degrees as an optimum. And you could make sure that you had a perch so that your entire area was covered, and then your hawks and owls can help you out. There's also these low tubes. This is from an NRCS project in a grassy area. Most voles live in grassy, meadowy settings. And one thing you can do is actually just keep them from getting at the base of the plant. This one, we actually stood there and had this discussion. Well, what about deer? And this guy who lived in an area where there weren't a lot of deer, so he might have been able to get away with that. So low chew control, yeah. And maybe even this, you could try having an owl nest box nearby, which would be pretty cool if it worked, which they do sometimes. So there we go. Okay, other chew control tactics. You know, you start reading about animal control, and almost always there's a chemical option that comes up. And this is me, and this is editorial bias. But the problem with just about all programs and use of poisons of whatever kind is the collateral damage. It's the bycatch. It's the things that eat the poison and they go somewhere else to die. And then who eats them when they go over there to die somewhere else? So, you know, there's options. There's a lot of ways you can study that, but I'm reluctant to advise any of them. There's traps. There are live traps like these, you know, your old have a heart. There's also snap traps. There's also those those old gopher traps, those squeeze ones that I guess they're allowing to be used. So there's kill traps and there's live traps, which takes some skill and some effort. But the good news with using traps or even shooting, you know, I mean, the thing about shooting something is, you know, you got that animal. So we had a little discussion about marmots before the session here, and you know, if you got something that you can see the animal and you know you want to get rid of them, well, there you go. I mean, shooting is a good tool because you know which animal you got, and if you're concerned about lead, you can use non-toxic projectiles. And that's what I use, is steel shot, even though I didn't shoot any gophers or anything with this. But there you go. So these are some tactics. I say tactics, not strategies. So a lot of us have seen this kind of damage. This is from a sapsucker. A sapsucker is a type of woodpecker, or types of woodpeckers. There's a couple species, and they wound trees through the bark into the sapwood so that the tree basically oozes sap. Now, something you can't tell is that these birds will come back to the same tree year after year. They did not make all these holes this year, and they will only open up certain sets of them I don't know if they leave the others to heal. I don't know how smart they are, but like those are active right there. You can see the little drop of sap, and those are not. And interestingly, these will be a feeding source for hummingbirds before the flowers come out. So hummingbirds will actually feed off of the sap wells that the sapsuckers have put in the tree. It generally doesn't kill the tree. It can kill branches, and we had an interesting discussion earlier today where the trees that get injured to where like a branch or something dies are often fruit trees or ornamentals of some kind that people don't want, to be wounded or die. Oh, here's a couple sapsuckers. This is the east side version, the red naped, and there's the red breasted, which you have. And when they drum, they go. It's staccato, not. Yes, and they do make a cavity, and they're really cool birds. Here's one taking a fecal sac out of the nest cavity that they've put in I believe, a cottonwood. So over on Vashon Island, here's one of those fruit trees that the sapsuckers, look at all the holes in this thing. I think that was their nest, but they had just stripped this tree, and this nice lady was like, she couldn't, so she armored the tree. And it worked. She said they leave it alone now. So there you go. Just for the good of the order, moles. A lot of people wonder about moles. So moles are amazing animals. They have and they're mostly on the west side of the Cascades. Incredibly dense fur, tiny eyes, big feet, and they live in subterranean burrow systems, and they push the dirt straight up. And they eat invertebrates. They don't eat trees. They don't eat vegetation. They eat worms and grubs and things, and they create this network of tunnels down below. Gophers do a similar thing, but gophers do eat vegetation. And in eastern Washington, pocket gophers can be a real problem dealing with trees. And I'll say something in a minute about that. Voles, gophers, moles, creating these subterranean tunnels actually generate a whole ecosystem unto itself where snakes and salamanders and insects and things will live in those cavities under the soil. I don't know, it's the subterranean ecosystem just amazes me. But moles make these big round things. They don't hurt your trees. They actually aerate the soil, and it is a big nuisance when you're trying to mow that grass. But there you go. Porcupines, there's an interesting rodent right there. Slow moving, nobody messes with them much because they're basically armored. But they were persecuted for many, many years because they have a bad habit of girdling trees up high on their stems. There was even rewards for porcupines for years out in the forest. And there's one right there sitting up in the tree. It wouldn't be very hard to shoot that buddy out of the tree there. And so porcupines, they girdle high in the tree. But, and I've been traveling around the state for 7 years doing this now, and I have heard very few porcupine stories, and it's a worthy research project, Kevin, somebody to figure out the demographics of contemporary porcupines. So there's a little bit of a shotgun on these different circumstances, but here's a summary of everything I kind of just walked through there. The first option, once you determine that you have a problem, might be to figure out if you can use some kind of a barrier. Armor it, a cage, a tube, a pile of branches, wire, something, a screen. If you can figure out where the problem is, just keep them from getting there and let your tree grow out of it, because most of these issues are in smaller trees, the ones we can really address. Or you might try repellents, particularly on arboretum, ornamental circumstances, or small numbers of trees. It does work, but you got to stay on top of it. You can use predator assist. I said perch poles, boxes, and even a dog, like a dog that barks at deer. I know they're not supposed to chase them, but that can help keep them away from certain trees. And then your last option is removal. That would be trapping, shooting, essentially whether or not you kill the animal. There are local services pretty much across the whole state called Critter Getter, and this might be the way to deal with the raccoon, that's in your barn, or the skunk or something. But and if you can catch them, excellent, relocate them. Technically it's not legal to move an animal off of your property or to someplace where you don't have permission. But if you get something in a trap. You get to decide what to do with it. So removal is your last option. And I want to kind of just remind us of this, that's where it gets a little complicated, because animals fall into three different categories, different legal categories. And the first one is something a game or a fur bearer, like rabbits are actually a game animal that you can possess, kill with the proper permits. Raccoons are a fur bearer with a really long season, but you can kill and possess. There's unprotected or unclassified animals like possums or starlings or English sparrows or even coyotes, interestingly, that you can control at will. Skunks fall into this category. It's a long list, but it's not exhaustive. And then most wildlife is actually in the category of, quote, protected, including special protected, like endangered species, and so most wildlife, you really are not allowed to just kill them when you don't like what they're doing. So this is worth teasing out, and the agency in charge of that hierarchy is the Department of Fish and Wildlife. And I just throw this up here. If you have a question about, can I take a fill in the blank? Call the regional office, get a hold of the wildlife staff. And this fellow, Dan Brenson, I just learned about him, is working with conflict resolution for things like elk or bears and that sort of thing. So there's his phone number. But the key is WDFW is in charge of that. And then your last option is, well, how about, can you put up with it? I mean, we're like, animal damage issues are generally not deal breakers for small forest landowners. And here's a website right down here that has a whole bunch of techniques and ideas about ways to control rodents. Notice we're talking about rodents chewing on young trees. So the worst forestry issues are down there in that realm of stocking, when your stand is just getting started. And I can go back to this picture because, we plant a lot of trees, and this is a even age Douglas fir planted stand. And look at this, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 19. There's 22 dead trees, and let's see, 1, 2. Okay, Kevin, give me a few minutes. I'm going to count all the trees on this hill. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20. There's 25 right there, green trees. So 50, 200, 300. So right in front of us, there's 22 dead trees and somewhere in the order of 400 to 500 live trees. Weren't you going to thin anyway? Wasn't that a little bit overstocked? So having a little bit of scattered mortality may not necessarily be a bad thing. I mean, maybe plant some extra trees. A lot of our stands are going to go to that. A lot of our conifer stands will wind up as a well-stocked second growth stand like that one of, mixed species. So sometimes it's not something to panic over, that you actually can tolerate it. And so that's one of the things to consider in the assessment of animal damage. So I just wanted to kind of wrap up with this guy, because mountain beavers are a really interesting animal. If you ever have these tunnels, and they have a tunnel system that goes down under the hill. Mountain beavers are about, oh gosh, probably 12 to 14 inches long. They look like a guinea pig, aren't they? A funky creature. Aplodontia rufa, it's the only member of this genus in North America. I don't think there's even one in South America, and they're kind of a, quote, primitive burrowing animal. Look at the whiskers on those guys. And they come up above the ground at night and will nip off vegetation and take it down into their burrow system, which has like chambers for pooping, chambers for sleeping, chambers for watching TV, chambers for storing food. And they're just this really interesting animal that is a problem if you're trying to grow something small and lush near the colony. And somebody asked a question earlier about mountain beavers contributing to trees blowing over in a windstorm. I would not doubt it, meaning there was just holes down there in the ground. So a mountain beaver is a mountain beaver. A vole is a vole. They're two entirely different genus. I don't think family, might even be in different families. It's so interesting that we have them here in Washington. Let's see. And so even at Green River Forestry College, their mascot is the mountain beaver. So there's Rudy, and look, that shows you how big they are. And so it's a really interesting animal that, truthfully, is rarely a problem for growing trees, except for when the trees are really little in a plantation and they make those holes. So yeah, there you go. So yeah, so habitat, critters living in trees. Here's the enhancement thing. There's a deer. Next week, I'm doing my last of these. It's going to be called "If You Build It, They Will Come." It's all about habitat enhancements. Be sure to sign up for that one. That'll be fun. I'd like to thank these people for photographs, including William Meyer for taking my picture with the ice cream cone, and Dave with some of the bear pictures, and my wife for some of the birds, Greg Thompson with his fabulous shots. And that's what I had. There's my email address. Send me your animal questions and things. Oh, it'll be great fun. And we can, send me a picture of the question and we can do a little exchange. It'll be great fun to do that. So I know that wasn't exhaustive in regard to a treatment of this, but what I was really after was to help with a framework for a way to address it, because often we will see a tree that got chewed on or something, and that's where we stop thinking about it. It's like, oh my God, I got to do something about that. And it's like, well, maybe you do, but maybe you don't. So there you go. Kevin, I'd like to point out that I finished right on time. Yes.
Yes, you did. And we will pause here for some questions. If you need to jump off for the evening, of course, that's just fine. Any residual Q&A here will be part of the recording. And maybe, I was looking at those bear pictures and I thought maybe Ken would even be willing to do the bear song here in a little bit.
We'll close with that. We'll close with an abbreviated version of the bear song.
That sounds good. All right, let me queue up some questions here for you.
Okay.
First one is, what do you think about paint and sand for beaver brows?
Oh yeah, thank you. That's, I've heard that works, but the paint has to be really rough. Like you put not glass, but they paint the bottom of the tree and then the beaver chews on it, and I think it works, but it might be a little dicey because you'd have to make sure you got the whole tree, and you'd have to be happy with having a painted tree. But I have heard that works. That might be something to look at Beavers Northwest and see what they say. Yeah, that's a good one.
If I can
Okay.
just interject for a moment, Kevin, just to remind anyone who wasn't here at the very beginning, if you need the SAF CEUs or the teacher clock hours for K through 12 teachers, send me, Brendan White, an email, and I'll get you the paperwork you need for that.
Thank you, Brendan. Oh, we have some also requests for the beaver song. Didn't you just write a beaver song?
I did actually, yes.
All right, well, word is out, so you have some requests for that. So here's a question. I have had some trouble with moles moving soil under new plantings, causing them to dry out and fail to die.
Buggers.
And then there's also a question about what caused the striping on the cedar on the right of that summary slide. Can you go back to that summary slide?
I wondered if somebody would notice that. Yes, check this out. This, I know the one you're looking for, right there. That one? Yes, that's the one, correct? Yep. Okay, that is that is a squirrel stripping off little teeny strips of the perfect bark to line their nest with. And it was a mystery. We couldn't figure it out. And one landowner, we looked at this and I said, it's not chewing, it's not rubbing. And he put a camera on it, and he actually got pictures of a Douglas squirrel pulling the little, which totally makes sense. And so sometimes, yeah, they use it as nest liner. And it'll only be on certain trees where they get it started, and try that with little strands. Good question.
Okay. Jason asks, so a creature that is nipping off the tips of peppers or tomatoes is likely not a deer, but maybe a mountain beaver?
Is the garden fenced? Is there a way for what could be getting in there to do that would be a question. How about a bird? I don't know. I'd have to see a picture of it. Not
I was
sure.
about to say crows seem like a likely option.
Yeah, yeah. Okay.
Okay. Okay, heard that DNR was looking into developing western red cedar stock that has increased turpentines in the foliage to deter browse. Is there any update on this?
I don't know. That sounds like a great idea, though. Give Webster Nursery a call. Um, John Trobaugh may know. That would be a long-term project. That'd be the kind of thing like developing blister rust resistant white pine. So that would take some time. Yeah.
Anecdotally, I've heard from landowners who found that the deer really like nursery seedlings, but wildlings they'll leave alone. So if they dig up their cedar seedlings from elsewhere on their property and plant those, that the deer tend to leave those alone. Anybody else have experience along those lines? Ken, do you have any thoughts?
Yes, I have heard that too. That the nursery cedars, probably because they were fertilized and that sort of things, they're just yummier. And you put a nursery cedar out in heavy deer country, and they'll find it. Boom, they'll eat it. It's amazing. We've seen that many times. Yeah,
So you could plant wildlings and then use the nursery stock as decoys.
that's not a bad idea. Wildlings, I like that.
Okay. And
Oh, there we go. Rick Edwards verifies yes, the Dawn Redwood and the cedars have similar bark. Nice.
And Jason notes that where he's having the garden problems, it was open. It's fenced now, though. Okay. Well, beaver or bear? What's your pleasure, Mr. Bevis?
We're gonna do the beaver.
All right.
Wait, this is a quick sound check. Can you guys hear that?
We can hear it.
Can you really? Okay,
It's a little quiet.
I think I can sing and just try not to sing too loud. So sound check. How's that?
Go for it.
I gotta chew, gotta chew, gotta chew, chew, chew. I gotta chew, gotta chew, gotta chew, chew, chew. 'Cause I'm a beaver and I'm the best damn builder in the world. Whoa, give me some willow, some cottonwood, a little bit of aspen, that would be good. Throw in some mud and Lord, I build you a dam. Slap, slap. Well, I'm a big old beaver. Oh man, am I able? I'll raise your water table. I'll make a home for the ducks and the toads, and I'll clog up your culverts and flood all your roads. I gotta chew, gotta chew, gotta chew, chew, chew. And gotta chew, gotta chew, gotta chew, chew, chew. 'Cause I'm a beaver. And Lord, I just gotta chew. Oh, give me some willow, some cottonwood, a little bit of alder, that would be good. Throw in some mud and Lord, I build you a dam. Slap, slap. Slap, slap.
Very
Yeah,
nice.
that'll do.
Folks, you heard it here first. I think this is the first landowner audience for the Beaver song. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct. It is a relatively new song. Adding to the wildlife repertoire. We've got the bear song, the woodpecker song, the beaver song. Yep. So see, when you all take coached planning, thank you, Mike. The live version of the class, you may have a chance to hear Kevin and I do a song together. That would be pretty amazing, yeah. So there we go.
Right.
So anything else? Anything else? Go
We
ahead.
have one follow-up question that came through, and in the meantime, how many of you would anybody like to also hear Ken do the bear song? You can punch your request and into the chat box, and we do take requests here on the show.
I've got a yes from Emily Hirsch. All right.
So back to the cedar stripping from the squirrels.
The headset in front of me. I know I need a better sound. I need a sound man. Scott Randy, get out here. Where's the sound man? Okay. Well, I've been sleeping for 4 months. Man, I'm kind of a mess. Whoa, I gotta get above ground, gotta find something to eat. I'm hungry. Hungry's a bear. Got little round eyes and ears. A sleek, shiny black coat. Yeah, I look kind of cute, but I'm really ornery. And mostly, I keep to myself, 'cause I'm a bear. A black bear. The American bear. The true bear, the true bear, the true bear. Ursus americana. I ain't no damn grizzly bear. Don't eat no bamboo, I don't sleep on the ice. I don't do no tricks for you. No, 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 'cause I'm a bear. Big Finish. True bear. Oh, Kevin,
Well,
we're gonna pack.
there's a very special treat for everybody tonight. A couple of musical numbers. Yeah, we didn't do that for the noon session. So those of you who held out for the evening session, you got a little extra treat here tonight.
A true bear door.
There we go.
Thank you. Oh, funny. Oh, yeah, that was. Oh, well, no, did that sound better with the second version?
That was better. Yes. However you set your
interesting.
mic up
Okay.
there. So we
Yeah,
had one
right.
follow-up question to the squirrel stripping. Does that do any serious damage?
I don't think so, because the bark that they were pulling was essentially the outer layer of the cedar. And if you ever try this, you can get remarkable little thin strands. I mean, the native peoples used to make, almost like fibers, or I mean cloth out of, not cloth, but they would use it as fibers. So, and I have found squirrel nest in cavities, well, actually in boxes before, that were made out of shredded bark, and I bet some others have too. So cedar bark, shoot, probably resists bugs. It's a great idea. And dawn redwood and eastern Wenatchee, eastern gray squirrels. So yeah, there we go. So hopefully this was helpful. And in general, most of our animal damage things are things that you can address creatively, and you might have to like trap out the voles, for example. You might decide, I can't handle that marmot anymore, and take them out. But whatever you do, do it thoughtfully with an objective in mind, and not just entirely reactionary every time. So I don't know. So we're going to do a couple more of these. Gosh, this was number 5, was it not, Kevin?
Oh no, we're beyond 5.
Are we? Okay,
I think we're on like 7 or something like that.
Nice. So let's call it halfway through then, out of 12. Well, I've got one more to go next Thursday on enhancements. So we're going to talk about habitat piles and boxes and water sources and how to create a snag, and it'll be great fun. Kevin, I have a series of photos of a bunch of kids making a habitat pile that I've never presented before. So we've got some first to the light of the world stuff.
Well, I can't wait.
Nice.
I don't see any more questions. So at this point, I am going to wish everyone a very pleasant good evening. And Ken, thank you so much for the great information and the music and the humor. We had a great time.
We did have fun. Thank you, Kevin and Brendan. You guys are you're rock stars, and I so am delighted to work with you and all our great landowners. So take advantage of the coach planning classes if you haven't already, online and otherwise. And we look forward to seeing you soon. Send us your
Have a good
questions.
night, Ken.
All right.
Enjoy
Thanks,
your evening,
Brendan.
everyone.
You too.
Good
Bye-bye.
night, everyone.